Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar, Fueling the Future, How Green Hydrogen and Direct Air Capture Will Decarbonize Aviation and Shipping. My name is Aoife O'Leary. I'm the CEO of Opportunity Green and the director of the SASHA Coalition. So we are shortly going to hear from our brilliant panel of speakers, but I'm just going to give a little bit of context as to what this webinar is about and what is the SASHA Coalition before we start. So at Opportunity Green, we launched the Skies and Seas Hydrogen Fuels Accelerator Coalition, or SASHA Coalition for short. And I'm sure very few of you will actually remember that long form name anyway, but you'll see it on our website if you ever want to check. But essentially what we are trying to do is accelerate the decarbonisation of both shipping and aviation, and also just ensure that the wider decarbonisation of the economy is in a more policy coherent manner. So as we know, both shipping and aviation are high emitting sectors at the moment, and left unabated will increase significantly and could potentially endanger the temperature goals we have in the Paris Agreement. So we're all very clear and aligned that they need to decarbonize. And we're going to hear today that green hydrogen and carbon dioxide from direct air capture are two critical technologies to decarbonize both sectors. They can be used in a number of different fuels. It could be e-kerosene, methanol, ammonia, or even the direct use of hydrogen. And you'll see there's a number of different pathways of how you get to all of that, which we'll get into in more detail. But in order for those fuels to be produced and for the transition to be successful, there needs to be a secure supply of both hydrogen, green hydrogen, and direct air capture for both shipping and aviation. At the moment, there's a huge risk that this will not be the case because policy and regulation is not necessarily in line to ensure that green hydrogen and direct air capture go to shipping and aviation as like no regrets sectors for those technologies. And so to address this challenge, we've launched the SASHA Coalition. This will bring together shipping and aviation to work with policymakers across transport, industry, energy, to really align policy and regulation to make all of that coherent so that both green hydrogen and direct air capture are used in the most effective ways and hopefully made available in the right quantities for both shipping and aviation. So today's webinar are going to lay out in a lot more detail that challenge and whether policy supports can actually accelerate this transition. So first of all, I am going to hand over to Sally Prickett from Arup, who is going to present some new research that they have done, which really goes through all of the technical side in a lot more detail than I have just mentioned. And then we're going to hear from some industry voices as well. But so for now, I will hand over to Sally.
And I've managed to unmute myself, which is a win to start with. Thank you very much for that introduction. I would say my name's Sally Prickett. I work for Arup as a director looking after hydrogen, CCS, and also sustainable fuels. I'm really just incredibly excited to be invited by SASHA to this launch event and to share some of the work that we've been doing in collaboration with them. For those that don't know who Arup are, we're a collection of engineers, consultants, and technical specialists, all dedicated to sustainable development and with an energy team who are working to decarbonise, help our clients to decarbonise and to meet the net zero challenges. And we're working across multiple sectors to do that. From my perspective, I always say I have a process engineering degree, but I haven't used it in anger too much of late. So please, in terms of technical questions, we'll have to see how well I go, but certainly able to present through some of the pathways. And I joined Arup in January. I'm very excited to be part of the organisation. I think next slide, please, is the appropriate term, Sabrina. So I'm going to spend, I think, the next 10 minutes I have allocated to talk about particularly the different pathways that are available to decarbonise the aviation and marine sectors, which are really important sectors to decarbonise. Transport as a whole makes up around 37% of total emissions globally, and of that, the marine and aviation sector together account for about 20% of that. And not only are they a large emitter, but they're also difficult to decarbonise compared to some of those other sectors because of the load duties that each of the technologies have. But there are multiple pathways to decarbonise and multiple fuel options available. This circle indicates where those fuels work in terms of sustainable shipping and in terms of sustainable aviation fuels. And we'll go into more detail on each of these. But I think what's really interesting here is the role that hydrogen plays across all of the pathways. So on the outer circle, you see the different fuels, and that inner circle is showing where hydrogen plays a part. And actually the only pathway where hydrogen, and particularly renewable hydrogen, is not part of the pathway is on direct electrification, where the feedstock for that hydrogen, renewable power, is a key element. And that's one of the key takeaways from our work that we've done with Opportunity Green and SASHA. We've also done a review of some of the policy aspects, which I'll talk to, and I know that's going to be a focus of other presentations coming up. Next slide, please. This is where we start to get a little bit more technical, and actually I can't see the right-hand side. Let me just move that. And to talk about the different pathways to decarbonise aviation. And if we start on the right-hand side of this picture, in terms of those different end fuels to decarbonise, we've got traditional jet fuel, but that traditional jet fuel being produced in a sustainable way, and there are multiple routes to get there. Using hydrogen as a direct fuel into aviation, and also the direct electrification of aviation. In terms of where the industry focuses today, it's very much on the traditional jet fuel and sustainable aviation fuel to support that, really because of the technical challenges of hydrogen electrification in terms of infrastructure and the planes to carry that fuel. So I'm now going to move slightly over to the left and how sustainable aviation fuel can be produced, and there are a number of ways to do that using different feedstocks, but all with hydrogen as an element, either as a base feedstock or as a way to increase the yields of the fuel production. The first block is a FT-based or Fischer-Tropsch based process in which sustainable carbon from either the direct CO2 source, such as direct air capture, or from waste streams, is used to produce syngas and then combined with renewable hydrogen to create a hydrocarbon fuel as traditional jet fuel. HEFA is probably the most viable technology today, and a number of projects are already producing commercial jet fuel from HEFA, but hydrogen is a part of that process, and it's an important way to increase those yields. We also have alcohol to jet, where we're using sugarcane or sugar beet and alcohol fermentation to create the hydrocarbon fuel for jets. And the final piece is around the hydrothermolysis jet, which is quite a new technology looking at plant oil, algae oil, or processing of waste to create the jet fuel. As I said, the key focus of industry is around this sustainable aviation fuel today, and it's a really important part of decarbonising aviation. Today, about 0.4% of aviation fuel is sustainable, That's expected to increase to 3% by 2030, but more needs to be done to increase the volume of sustainable fuel in that sector in order to meet the Paris targets. Sustainable carbon is clearly an important feedstock alongside hydrogen and is likely to be a limiting factor in terms of the available feedstock for these fuels. And it's the reason why all of these pathways are likely to be important for the decarbonisation of aviation, but also why direct air capture will be critical in terms of sourcing sustainable carbon for fuels and the Fischer-Tropsch pathway. As I said, hydrogen and direct electrification are also expected to play a part in aviation decarbonisation, but they'll be for specific uses and will require technology development as well as infrastructure changes at airports and on planes. If we want to go to the next slide, I'll talk a little bit around the marine pathways, which are somewhat different. So in terms of marine, as I said at the start, really a critical decarbonisation requirement to reach the net zero targets. About 0.84 gigatons of CO2 are produced by the marine industry in 2021. And of that, only about 0.3% is sustainable, with the majority of the fuel being heavy fuel oil or marine gas oil. Again, starting on the right-hand side of this slide, we've got some different fuels to the aviation side, where we can use hydrogen directly for some marine uses, and then ammonia, methanol, or a sustainable methane fuel or liquefied methane fuel to decarbonise marine. Again, as with aviation, you would expect all of these pathways to be critical in decarbonising the marine sector, and all of them require a renewable hydrogen feedstock in order to produce them. And therefore, the ability to produce renewable hydrogen at scale to decarbonise marine will be absolutely vital. In the ammonia pathway, we combine nitrogen from air capture with the hydrogen through the Haber-Bosch process to produce ammonia, which can be used in ships, and that technology is advancing quickly and is expected to scale, but does require some new engines for the vessels. Methanol is slightly easier in terms of that end use application, but does require a sustainable carbon molecule in order to produce it. And that sustainable carbon molecule from direct air capture or other sources is then combined with hydrogen through a hydrogenation process to create the synthetic methanol for marine. And finally, there is an opportunity to produce a sustainable methane molecule through a sustainable biogenic feedstock to create methane, which is then liquefied. Again, an opportunity to increase yields through the use of renewable hydrogen. So I think you've seen a similar story here to aviation, where critical sector to decarbonise, not easy to do. We need to create some new fuels and some new technologies. And the role of hydrogen across all of these pathways is absolutely critical. If you go on to the next slide. And as I said, I'm just going to touch a little bit on the policy picture for marine and for the aviation sector. And I think in the aviation sector, we're starting to see some momentum towards sustainable aviation fuel. But there is more to be done. And I think we're going to hear a little bit more about that later on today. The Refuel EU policies and the UK jet fuel strategy are providing support and momentum to actually develop sustainable aviation fuel projects and bring investment into the value chain. And I think we're also seeing momentum not just driven from the policy and the regulation, but actually from the end consumers of those fuels to drive emissions targets and the corporate objectives. And I think that's going to be a really important part of moving the industry forward. If you go to the next slide, please. So on marine, fundamentally a little bit more challenging than aviation, because the shipping industry generally uses flags of convenience, so not necessarily attached to those regions that we're operating in. But there is a desire to decarbonize, and we're seeing an increasing number of national level targets to actually push for the decarbonisation of marine. The Fuel EU mandate sets a framework to increase the share of fuels, and I think international organisations are really stepping up to play their part here, with the International Maritime Organisation setting a goal of 50% of total reduction by 2050. And I think we have an expectation, a hope, that target is going to increase. There's also a piece around, again, similar to aviation, that this isn't just driven by policy, it's also driven by the users of the fuel. And that's bringing momentum into creating investable projects to develop these fuels, and is going to be an important part of moving forward. But we can't underestimate the need for the right regulation and the right policy to actually create the business case to drive investment at the pace that's required to decarbonise these sectors and meet the Paris Agreement goals. Next slide, please. And just to kind of tie all of that together, and the messages I really want to leave with you today. The first is that although we talk about multiple different pathways to decarbonise aviation and to decarbonise maritime fuels, in nearly all cases, hydrogen is a key feedstock for the production of those sustainable fuels to a greater or lesser extent, whether it's to improve the yields or as a fundamental feedstock to produce the fuel. We also see that multiple fuels and pathways need a sustainable carbon atom in order to create those fuels. And being able to produce that carbon at scale will be important, and DAC will play a very crucial role in doing that. We also see that there are multiple different pathways to decarbonise each of these sectors. And the reality will be that many of those, nearly all of those pathways will be required to meet the goals, because we will have a feedstock limitation across the sector. On policy, we see that the EU policy is driving uptake of fuels, and while the UK hasn't published the targets, we expect them to provide some ambitious sustainable aviation fuel mandates as well. The shipping regulations are more difficult to implement, but we're seeing organisation and key players across the industry starting to act now to create the demand to drive the investment in the production of those fuels. So I do think we're at a really critical point of the industry, and the SASHA coalition, bringing together the key players across both the aviation and maritime industry to coordinate across policy and also advocating for how the feedstocks are accessed, produced and fed into these pathways will be really important. So I'm looking forward to the rest of the conversation today. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Sally. That was really, really brilliantly done, and showing just how vital green hydrogen and direct air capture is. We are next going to hear from Lord Deben, the chair of the UK Climate Change Committee, who we are very honoured to have here to give a quick keynote on shipping and aviation and green hydrogen and direct air capture. But just while he gets ready, just to mention again, anyone, if you've got questions, comments, etc., please throw them in the Q&A down there, and we will be getting to them very shortly as well. So without any further ado, I will hand over to Lord Deben. Thank you so much for joining us, and looking forward to hearing your remarks.
Well, thank you very much, and I'm sorry that the technology at this end didn't link up when it was supposed to, so I sat here looking at nothing and hearing nothing for quite a bit before we managed to get in. Not your fault at all. I really want to put the picture rather more severely than your last speaker. I found what she had to say extremely interesting and technically really valuable. But I do think we have to start by accepting that the international situation, both politically and commercially, is very difficult. So if I do it in reverse order, and first of all think about the marine world, the truth is that we have a system that doesn't really work, because the International Maritime Organization has amongst its members many countries who really don't have a great maritime interest and are, I'm afraid, inclined to be able to be manipulated by those who really don't want change. We've had huge trouble even to get to the very limited demand, which your last speaker perfectly rightly pointed to, which is a 50% reduction by 2050, but this is totally out with what we really have to have. And the reason for that is that there are certain countries which are determined to try to slow this whole thing down. And there is no doubt that the Russians in particular have been extremely unhelpful in trying to get the marine organization to be able to do its job. Now, it is better than it was, but it doesn't seem to me that it is going to be able to deliver the basic issues that we need if we're going to use hydrogen in the ways which we have just talked about. And what we need, therefore, is a series of different interventions. First of all, the industry itself has made a great deal more leadership. We have seen with Maersk some really serious decision making, and much to be encouraged. But as has been said, the problem with fishing, shipping, is that very large numbers of boats are under flags of convenience, and the normal means by which we can restrict and change these things are not there for us. So what do we do about that? First thing is that there are many areas of the world where it would be very sensible for us to set standards in advance, to say, well, if you want to bring your ships in to the waters of the European Union and Britain, it is, of course, a great disadvantage that Britain has left the European Union, but we have to think about this as if we were part of it, because we're going to have to be part of it in these systems. That if you want to do that, then you've actually got to meet some standards, and those standards will rise year by year, so that we will outpace what the IMO is able to do. And that will help the IMO, because what it will mean then is that the IMO will recognize that it can't carry through its prime purpose, which is to be the world regulatory system, without understanding that various parts of the world are really, frankly, not going to put up with the speed with which these things are happening. And so I believe we're going to have much more action by governments, much more action by other international bodies, and particularly in areas which are very subject to regulation. It will be increasingly difficult for countries in the European Union, Britain, and even in the United States to put up with a situation in which they impose rules and regulations at home which are not in fact met by the shipping industry. And the reason we put shipping and aircraft in the same box, so to speak, is not only for the very good reasons which have already been adumbrated, but also because these are international movements, and you can't deal with them in quite the national way in which the measurement of carbon is done. As you know, we measure carbon by what you produce at home. This is not entirely satisfactory because consumption emissions are vital too. But it's the only way in which you don't get double counting, and it's the only way in which you can insist upon people controlling those emissions over which they have direct control. Now, the problem with the aircraft industry and with the shipping industry is that neither of these are under that kind of direct control. Their emissions take place over a long and big area. They start from one place, they go to another, and then go on to another. And the emissions aren't counted in the way in which we need them to be counted if they are to be reduced. And so international agreement is absolutely crucial, which is why I started with the simple example of the IMO. Now, when it comes to aviation, that becomes even more important because IATA, which represents these, which is supposed to be the international agreement, does have this real issue, which is if you impose any of the things which we might want to impose in terms of restrictions, then aviation is able to avoid that by going to places, by filling up in places, by choosing places where those rules are not enforced. And so internationally, we have to make agreements, and we have to make them so that they do open the way for the better use of sustainable fuels. And in that pattern, as has already been said, there is no doubt that hydrogen will play a very important part. And therefore, on the aviation front, once again, I do think we're going to have to work very hard across multiple fronts in order to make it necessary for people actually to use sustainable fuel. Many of the major companies want to do this. They are very often flag carriers whose countries are taking all this very seriously. And there are good signs that the industry is very serious about wishing to meet what one might call jet zero as an aim. The problems, and I merely leave these with you, the problems are that all too often they set examples of dates which are well ahead. The difficulty with that is that the people who are responsible today won't be around to take the to take the responsibility when those dates are reached. We need all the time to press the urgency of change. Second issue is that there is still some competition between people saying that this is one answer that's the right one and all the others are wrong. I'm a great believer that these are not either ors, these are both and I thought our first speaker was so good on that. There is a mixture of what we have to do to solve these problems, and the resources which we will need are such that we will probably have to use every one of the examples that she has put forward. But there are some in the industry who clearly are not even beginning to work on these fronts. And I do think that we need to challenge governments to say that they are not putting up with this any longer. I'll give you just one example. ExxonMobil, which after all is the company with the worst history in dealing with climate change of any company at all, ExxonMobil is building a new pipeline for fossil fuels from Fawley to Heathrow, which will carry something like 147% of the present pipeline. Now that makes nonsense of their promise that they are going to be net zero by 2050, because this assumes that they will be able to sell not just what they're selling now in terms of fossil fuels, but some significant increase. And the pipeline, if it lasts as long as the present pipeline, will be lasting right the way up into the 2070s. Now, this means that ExxonMobil is not involved in the efforts that we have made. You could not make this investment without believing that it will be a stranded asset, unless you think that you're going to be able to go on doing what you're doing now, even though it is changing the world's climate so disastrously. And so I do think that it is necessary for those who are within this great coalition working together to say we really also have to point the finger at those who are not, because it is not fair to ask people to make the kinds of changes which you're doing and are seeking to do, and still allow others to operate in a way which is not restricted by any interests in the battle against climate change. So I hope very much that we will understand that ExxonMobil is one of the companies that has got to change its attitude. And until it does so, then governments and individuals have to take steps to ensure that they do not use the services of a company which is not prepared. I take ExxonMobil because it is particularly bad, but there are others too. And our job is to exercise our choice so that we help those who are trying to do what we are all trying to do, because this is not just a matter of research and delivery. It's not just a matter of governments and intervention, not just a matter of international bodies and international agreements. It's also a huge matter of the individual business and the individual person's commitment to do what, as you rightly have said, is one of the most difficult things of all, which is the creation of a shipping and an aircraft industry which is fit for the future, which can give the great freedom which those industries do give, but can do it without costing the earth.
Thank you, Lord Deben, for that great challenge to us all to step up our game, especially I think the companies involved. And actually that's the perfect segue, because now we are going to hear from the two industries themselves. First of all, we're going to hear from the Shipowners Association, the European Community Shipowners Association, their Director of Shipping and Trade Policy, Luisa Puccio, and then we're going to move into the airline sector. But for now, why don't I hand over to Luisa, who I'm sure will have several remarks to respond to already. So, Luisa.
Thank you, Aoife, and thank you for the invitation to this webinar today. We're very happy to be here. My name is Luisa Puccio. I'm Director for Shipping and Trade at the European Community Shipowners Association. I will follow up on what Sally was saying earlier on. I am not an engineer, I am a policy person. So today I will focus mostly on what I know best, which is European policy when it comes to shipping. A couple of words of introduction on EXA. We are an association of associations, so we represent 20 national associations of shipowners at EU level and Norway. And we have as also an observer member the UK. We used to be a member, but unfortunately because of Brexit now are in an observer position in our association, but we keep a very close cooperation with them still. Perhaps as a way of an introduction, of course, the European shipowners, we represent around 40% of the global tonnage. And for this particular reason, and of course, shipping is a global sector. When it comes to the debate on decarbonization and the debate that Lord Deben had highlighted so well just now, our position has always been we need global solutions because we need to be able to decarbonize at a global level and maintain a level playing field. That being said, we are, of course, European ship owners. We deal mostly, our main regulators is the European Union. And we have been very much engaged in the debate that's been going on in the last couple of years on the Fit for 55, looking at the climate goals of the EU, the 55 reduction of greenhouse gas by 2030, and the climate neutrality goal by 2050 at societal level. And as shipping, our position when we saw this was, of course, we prefer a global solution, but things need to happen as well. We need to contribute to the overall goal, and also we need market signals to see, how we can kickstart this decarbonization process, which, as also Sally has highlighted earlier on, together with aviation, shipping is one of the most difficult sector to abate. Perhaps going into a little bit what we are looking at EU level, and how the environment is changing a little bit in terms of what the regulators are saying to us and how we are working towards decarbonization. First of all, the way sometimes the EU presents this to us, I find it very interesting. It's a carrot and stick situation where the sticks are the regulation that we have now on the table when are almost now outside the process, the inclusion of shipping in the EU ETS, coupled with, of course, the Fuel EU Maritime, which looks specifically at the fuel and the greenhouse gas intensity reductions that we need to achieve. When it comes to specifically about the Fuel EU, I think because this is where we get into the debate a little bit also about the green hydrogen, which is a topic of today. As a ship owner in the EU right now, we need to do two things. Just looking at the regulations, whenever we are coming in and out of the EU, this is not just European ship owners, it's all ships that come in and out of the EU, we need to pay into the ETS system, starting from reporting from next year and then paying for 2025. Which of course is a measure to eventually drive down the emission. On the other hand, we have the Fuel EU, and the Fuel EU looks at, it puts on ship owners targets for intensity reduction, greenhouse gas intensity reduction, that grow with the time. So we start with a rather moderate approach, but it goes higher and higher in the years to come. This is an approach that we as ship owners have actually supported from the start. We actually advocated for higher targets, but this needed to be coupled with availability of fuel. And this is not something that is fully reflected in the regulation as we see it now. We have also other regulation at EU level which help a little bit with this. But what we don't see at the regulatory level is really, in simple words, targets on fuel suppliers that will ensure that the shipping industry can actually meet our reduction targets from when they are imposed. And here I think what we have advocated for as EXA is basically a mechanism whereby we have let's say a shared responsibility between fuel suppliers and ship owners. So we need to meet our targets, so we will buy the fuel, but the fuel needs to be available. So and this for us it would be a great way to also give a market signal, because what ultimately we need, and this is not something that will come very easily, it's not something that we expect tomorrow, but we need to develop this, is basically an adequate supply of fuels and an affordable supply of fuels. Of course, the price will come down with the volumes, but right now what we are seeing is that we don't have, even if the fuels were available, the price gap is still too high. To what Lord Deben was saying earlier on, what we see is already quite a good number of, let's say, first movers in the market, which I think are really driving the discussion here. But let's also not forget another thing, that within our membership, the vast majority of our ship owners are small and medium enterprises. So this is where also the difficulty comes in, because I think also Lord Deben used the word stranded assets. For most of our ship owners, it's very difficult to make that decision on in what propulsion, in what new fuels to invest. As Sally was saying earlier on, this normally requires new engines. So we need to also, especially for the medium and small ship owners, that investment decision is very, very difficult to make, both from a financing point of view, because the financing, especially in Europe, is very difficult. But also there is a degree of risk now, which, of course, we cannot fully correct for regulation, but basically a better idea of a market signal would be good down the line. For this, actually, to cite I think a very good outcome of the negotiations that we saw at European level, which I think will also drive quite well the debate on the future fuels and on the fuels that we're talking about today, is that if you're looking at the way the EU has built its ETS for shipping, what we advocated very strongly within EXA and also with some of the other stakeholders at EU level was for a dedicated envelope. So some of the revenues from the EU ETS coming from shipping to go back to shipping. And this is, in the example I was given before, the carrot to the stick. And what we are looking at now is a dedicated envelope, a dedicated calls under what in the EU is called the Innovation Fund. We are now working very closely with all the stakeholders and the European Commission to define the criteria for which shipping and also its supply chain could apply for this. But from our side, one of the main points that we would like these resources to be put to is actually bridging the gap between the cost of clean and conventional fuels, because this will give support to the fuel suppliers to produce, and then of course will give us an adequate, hopefully an adequate supply at a price that will incentivize more ship owners to uptake cleaner technologies. And perhaps to the point of this hearing, when Sabrina was presenting earlier on, she had a very, very good overview of all the different regulatory initiative at member state level, at EU level. I will add another thing here, which I think is rather relevant for the discussion on the hydrogen that we are having now. If you look at what the European Union has put on the table now, we have a proposal for a Net Zero Industry Act. And this looks at the technologies that need to be developed in Europe to be able to have a net zero industry by 2050. And we have, I won't go into the details here, of course, we have just a proposal. By the time this ends, it will probably look rather different. But we have a number of sectors of technologies which are identified as strategic technologies, for which a target, I think, of 40% by 2040 in terms of development of industrial capacity is foreseen. And here we have, for example, fuel cells, hydrogen production. What our point is as a shipping industry is that is all well and good. I think Sally was making the point that we need basically the green hydrogen as a feedstock at the start. We need that capacity in order to be able to transform this in sustainable fuels for shipping and also for aviation. What we see now in the proposal is that this step is missing. So what we are strongly advocating for is to have as a target, as a strategic technology, not just hydrogen production, but all that industrial capacity that we need to translate that hydrogen in sustainable fuels for shipping. And I won't speak for aviation, but I think they could probably come into that pot as well. And this is, I think, for us, something that we see as a great opportunity to decarbonize shipping. In Europe right now, we don't have enough capacity. And I saw, I think, a question in the Q&A earlier on about we also face competition from other modes, which are easier to decarbonize as a lower hanging fruit. And member states can use those to meet their own targets rather than investing in capacity for sectors which are more difficult to abate. So I think from my side, I will leave it here. I realize I went a lot into policy, but hopefully this was helpful. And of course, very happy to answer any question afterwards.
Great. Thank you so much, Luisa, for that intervention and overview of what's going on in shipping. And as you say, I think aviation also has a lot to say. So without anything more, I will hand over to Laurent Donceel, who's the Managing Director at Airlines for Europe. So to you, Laurent.
Thanks, Avifi. Thanks, everybody. I'm going to be short. Laurent Donceel on behalf of Airlines for Europe. So we represent the European airlines operator. Our members are Ryanair, EasyJet, BA, brands that I'm sure you know very well, based both in the continent but also in the UK. There's a couple of points I wanted to mention already. A lot has been said, very interesting. First of all, I want to congratulate you on the initiative on the coalition. I think it's very exciting and it's very crucial that you're focusing on this. And it's particularly timely in the discussion that we are now, as if you look more generally at the economic environment that we are driving. We're getting into discussions about the future economic landscape and possibly all going into recession. And some of the discussions about the future of the climate policy might become harder to address now than it may have been 3 or 4 years ago. And I think it's particularly important, especially from the industry perspective, that we keep an eye on the price. And the eye on the price for us is that, we need to focus on making from the aviation sector the continent, and that also includes the UK, to make the continent skies the most efficient and environmentally friendly in the world. And that's not easy. As for shipping, as we just mentioned earlier, aviation is one of the hardest sectors to decarbonize. And unfortunately, maybe compared to other modes of transport, there is no magic wand. There is no miracle solution. And from the aviation side, we need to focus on the range of measures to achieve the climate objective. But the ultimate objective, I think, is clear for everybody, is no CO2 coming out of the tailpipe of the industry. That's what we want. Question is how we're going to get there, how much it's going to cost, and how soon we will be there. But I just want to make that very clear as a first point. The second point I wanted to mention, you may have seen it both in the UK, but also on the European side, industry has developed a number of roadmaps that show a path towards carbon neutrality by 2050. The European front, we have something called Destination 2050, which also sees how we can reduce by 55% our CO2 emission, both for the intra-European flights and all flights departing Europe by 2030, whilst also increasing traffic growth. Maybe not in all parts of Europe, but certainly in many parts of Europe, the traffic will still grow and people still want to go and travel, and we actually think it's a good thing. But the way to get there basically will be focused on 4 pillars. One of them is the new technologies, and that include hydrogen and the electricity, improved air navigation, sustainable aviation fuel. Sally has mentioned some of that earlier, but also the carbon market and carbon pricing. Now I will come back to that in a minute. But basically, from this roadmap, the importance of the zero emission propulsion for aviation is clear, as particularly for the short haul flight and the medium haul flight. The hydrogen-powered single-aisle aircraft on intra-European routes are available around 2035. It's clear that for a number of aircraft operators, the business model could change radically to adopt a hydrogen-powered aircraft, and that's extremely fascinating, but also opens to a number of questions, which I hope we can also address today. In the meantime, we also hope that this will pave the way for the development of technology for the long haul. So your typical transatlantic flight, where alternatives to liquid not likely to be available in the medium term. And to put a figure on that, basically we see that by 2050 we could abate or we could reduce roughly 60 million tons of CO2 through hydrogen-powered aircraft on the intra-European journey. That's roughly 1/5 of the whole carbon footprint of the aviation sector in Europe. Now, how do we get there? For the moment, because of the technology and the engine, there is no alternative to the liquid fuel. So, as we mentioned earlier, we discussed about sustainable aviation fuel, the biofuels. The path is the following: we start with bio-based sustainable fuels, and hopefully soon enough switch to advanced biofuels, which are electrofuels, synthetic fuels, which also require hydrogen. And this is the first element of support for hydrogen that we see happening quite soon, because even the European legislation, not wanting to take you down too much into the EU regulatory rabbit hole, but as of 2030, we will need to have synthetic fuels at all European airports that airlines, any airlines, whether European or non-European, will have to uplift, and that's a good thing. And then in the medium to long term, that's switching into hydrogen as a fuel and turning increasingly use less carbon into useful carbon. The other point I want to mention, because we talked earlier about the intricacies or the difficulties of agreeing at the European level versus the rest of the world. And I think here we need to be very clear that Europe and the UK, by the way, has taken a position of climate leader, and it's a good thing. And we don't think that we should hold back until the rest of the world aligns to move forward on a number of issues. And that is true for the biofuels, but it's also true for the carbon pricing. Carbon pricing, it's not necessarily the most obvious element we think about when we talk about hydrogen, but it's essential to incentivize the deployment of the decarbonization technologies. And currently in the aviation sector, the global carbon price is not high enough to incentivize the support of deployment of these technologies. So we need to work on that, because that's the most important price signals that will get the economic operator to start looking more closely into hydrogen. And that will help us support the reaching the climate target. And maybe the last thing I want to mention, also within the context of this coalition, is what the current discussions on the energy transition is teaching us, is that we cannot have these discussions about aviation and I imagine also shipping without thinking about the wider environmental and energy policy mix. We need to have a wider discussion within the public and private actors to look into all the obstacles, and there will be many of them. I don't want to sound too negative, but we need to look into access to finance, the energy supply, the infrastructure requirement, the economic incentive, the research. In the case of hydrogen, for the hydrogen power aircraft, we need to start looking into whether we need to prioritize the use of energy compared to where alternative solutions are available. And that also looks into the future for the road transport. Electrify the road transport to free the feedstock in the hydrogen where it's most needed, and that may indeed be for the aviation. That is something that we hope we see as part of the future of the coalition, and certainly there's strong commitment from our end to work on that. I think I will stop there, but happy to take any further questions.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Laurent. We are definitely running over time, but what I'm going to try and do is merge some questions together and throw them at you guys for like a really short answer, if that's all right. So I think the kind of most, I guess, asked questions were around this kind of prioritization question. So apologies for like kind of mangling Andrew and Finley's questions together. But the question was really, how do we prioritize? Because we all know direct electrification is the most efficient, and there are sectors that still need more direct electrification. Yet at the same time, shipping and aviation are going to need green hydrogen direct air capture. And then there are other sectors that are also competing for these, that potentially have other decarbonization pathways, some others that don't. I'd just be interested if any of the panelists have one or two sentences on how they feel like we go about kind of resolving these dilemmas, and yeah, what the kind of next steps in figuring that out would be. Does anyone want to jump in first? Laurent, go for it.
Yeah, I might, unless somebody wants to step in. I think, unfortunately, as is the case for simple questions comes complicated answers. Intuitively, from coming from a sector that is hard to abate, we would be in favor of the prioritization to the hard to abate sectors. We can't use electric batteries on aircraft, so that possibly is easier to access for other modes of transport. But, and unfortunately, there's a but to that. I think this is part of the discussions that we need to start having now. Now the technologies have been identified. Are we as sectors, in terms of, and also keeping in mind the affordability of air transport, for example, are we better off prioritizing certain types of energy or sharing the burden of the investment, and it will be quite a lot of that, with other modes of transport, in terms of what it would mean from a cost-wise and investment-wise? And that's an answer that I cannot, that's a question I cannot answer for the moment, beyond the recognition that, yes, for some sectors, you have more alternative than others.
It's Lord Deben, I think you want to come in. You're on mute, but 1 second.
We certainly think that in the Climate Change Committee that we should make it clear that the amount of biomass that we've got available is limited, and that there are certain sectors which should have first call on that, and the aviation sector is obviously the most important of those. And that is very clearly the policy of the Climate Change Committee and our advice to the British government. And that's why we have been pretty careful about proposals to use biomass for things which don't need it, and because they can use other means of, for example, electric generation. And I think we have to stick to that. It is very difficult to get rid of fossil fuels in aviation, and therefore the industry needs every bit of help that it can have. It also has to try to remove all the other sources of emissions which are associated with it. It seems to me that this is a much bigger and wider thing. And very often airports themselves can do a huge amount to reduce the actual energy, the actual emissions caused by their operations. So a mixture of the direct help, which I suggest in terms of reserving biomass and helping in the research that is done there, making this a key part of the experimentation and work being done on hydrogen. And on the other side, the industry itself looking not just at the emissions from aeroplanes, but the whole system needs a very, very close attention, and a great deal can be done to remove the emissions that are very much associated with airports.
Brilliant. Thank you. And with that, I'm afraid actually we're basically at time. So apologies for all the answers or all the questions that didn't answer, and all of the answers that our panelists probably had for those questions that didn't get to be said. I guess just quickly to say, for any of the shipping and aviation sectors that are interested in joining the coalition, please just get in contact with me. My email is there. I think it'll come back up in a second on the slide. And you'll find me online and all the rest of it anyway. So just a huge thank you to everyone who joined the webinar, but especially obviously our panelists. And a special thank you to Lord Deben for coming in and giving us your keynote, and apologies for the IT at the start. I'm afraid that always happens to at least one person, and I'm afraid today it was you. So thank you so much, everyone. I hope you enjoyed it. I think there's a lot more to discuss. I think we could keep talking probably for another day or so. We are going to capture a lot of this in a blog and do next steps and all of that. So if you keep an eye on the SASHA website and Twitter and everything, you'll see what is happening next with the coalition. So thank you so much, everyone who attended, and all our panelists.